Hello everyone, I am Aparna Srikumar. This video lecture is from PRASAD'S Coaching Institute for Banking and SSC. In this video, I will be teaching you Indian polity. Topic is Regulatory Acts. What is Regulatory Act? I will give you a quick introduction. We all know that the British East India Company came to India as traders. Gradually, they conquered the land and started ruling it. And our freedom fighters struggled a lot to get our country back to its people. And finally, India got its independence on 15th August 1947 by passing the Indian Independence Act at the British Parliament. And we started the administration of our own country based on Indian Constitution. Obviously, it was not an overnight process. Transfer of power happened gradually. And in this video, we will discuss a concise and chronological description of events and acts that led to it. For the ease to understand, the regulatory acts can be divided into two parts, Part 1 and Part 2. In Part 1, we will discuss how the power got transferred from British East India Company to the British government. In Part 2, we will discuss how the power got transferred from British government to the Indians. For your understanding, in Part 1 and Part 2, these many acts or events happened. In Part 1, almost 7 acts are there. In Part 2, 11 acts or events are there. So, let's start with our first act, the Regulating Act of 1773. In 1773, it was a very bad situation for British East India Company in India. They were under financial crisis. There was allegation of corruption against its officials. Also, the company lost a war with the Hyder Ali of Mysore. So, in order to get out of this situation, the British East India Company asked for help from the British government. Thus, the British government started involving in Indian politics. They enacted a regulatory act in 1773 over British East India Company to control the activities of the company. British government did not take over the power completely, but this act was passed merely to regulate the activities of the company. What are the main features of this act? The main administrative centers of British East India Company in India was Madras, Bombay and Bengal. They all had a governor and they all were ruled separately. So by this act, the governors in council at Madras and Bombay were brought under the control of Bengal. Thus, Governor of Bengal Warren Hastings elevated to Governor General of Bengal, Madras and Bombay. Thus, it led to a centralized administration in India. Also, a Supreme Court was established at Calcutta. But this act also had some defects. It did not stop the corruption against the company officials. Also, the concerns of the common people was not addressed. Also, Supreme Court's power was not well defined. All these defects led to the formation of the next act, known as the Pitt India Act of 1784, also known as the East India Company Act 1784. This act was passed in order to correct the defects of 1773 Act. This act made a distinction between the commercial and political activities of the company. The commercial activities were still a monopoly of the company, but the political activities, that is the civil and military administration, were under the British Crown now. Thus, the company became subordinate to British government. Also, this Pitt India Act resulted in dual control of British possession in India. Dual control means two parties are there. The first party being the British government, and the second company being the company. In this dual system of control, the company was represented by Court of Directors and the British government was represented by Board of Control. The presidencies of Madras and Bombay became subordinate to Bengal presidency. In effect, Calcutta became the capital of British possession in India. Then comes the Charter Act of 1793. This act was passed in British Parliament. The company's charter, the trade monopoly, was renewed for another 20 years. all the Charter Act renewed the company's charter for next 20 years. So this act was passed on 1793. The next Charter Act comes after 20 years. The next Charter Act is 1813 Charter Act, also known as the East India Company Act of 1830. This act by the British Parliament renewed the East India Company's charter for another 20 years. But something else also was happening in Europe during 1830. A French statesman, Napoleon Bonaparte, prohibited the import of British goods into French allies in Europe. So the British merchants and traders suffered because their trade market was gone. So they demanded their government that they be given a share of British trade in Asia and dissolve the monopoly of East India Company. The government has to agree, and finally the merchants were allowed to trade in India after 1830. Thus the trade monopoly, the commercial activities of the company was ended in India except of the trade with China. Also by this act, the Christian missionaries were allowed to spread the religion in India. Then comes the Charter Act of 1833. By this act, the company lost its monopoly of trade with China also. And the company lost its monopoly on trade with China also. So company is no longer a commercial body now. It became purely an administrative body. Also, this act extended the charter of the company by another 20 years. By this act, it redesignated the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India. Thus, the Lord William Bentinck became the first Governor General of India. The Governor General's government was known as the Government of India and his council as the Indian Council. Thus, the country's administration was unified under one control. Also, the control of island Saint Helena is transferred from East India Company to the Crown. Thus, this act is also known as the Saint Helena Act of 1833. Then comes the Charter Act of 1853. Unlike the previous Charter Act, which extended the company's charter for 20 years, this Charter Act extended the company's rule for indefinite period. That means it can be taken over by the British government at any time. The company's influence was further reduced by this act. For the first time, the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council were separated. This act served as the foundation of modern parliamentary form of government. The legislative wing of the Governor General's Council acted as a parliament on the model of the British government. Then comes the Government of India Act 1858. This act was an after effect of the revolt of 1857. The revolt is also known as our first war of independence. What happened in 1857? A lot of people, princes, landlords, were annoyed by the British style of reforms. They were not satisfied by the judicial system. Also, the Indian soldiers were not treated in par with the British soldiers. All these factors led to Indian revolt of 1857. But the trigger for the revolt was something else. The trigger was the introduction of a new rifle in the army, which forced the sepoys to bite off its cartilage greased with cow and pig fat. Since the cow is sacred for the Hindus and pig is sacred for the Muslims, this activity hurted the religious sentiments of both the religions. This triggered the revolt of 1857. The British government suppressed the revolt. But as companies' misrule and insensitive practices were seen as one of the major causes of the revolt, British Parliament decided to liquidate the company after suppressing the revolt. Thus, the company's rule over British territories in India came to an end, and it was passed directly to the British government. The Court of Directors and Board of Control were scrapped. Then, how the administration of India happened. The power of the crown were to be exercised by the Secretary of State for India. The Secretary of State was a British MP and a member of British Prime Minister's cabinet. Secretary of State was assisted by a council of 15 members. One of his members is called Governor General in Council. He is the person responsible for the administration of all the provinces. The country was divided into provinces headed by the governor or lieutenant governor, aided by his executive council. The provincial government had to function under the direction and control of Governor General in Council in all matters. Governor General is also called Viceroy, both the same person to avoid conflict. Governor General or Viceroy was a representative of British government. He was ultimately responsible to the Secretary of State. This act abolished the dual government of Pitt's India Act. Thus, the first Secretary of State of India was Lord Stanley, and first Governor General or the Viceroy of India was Lord Canning. By this act, the Government of India Act 1858, the company's rule was fully ended in India. Thus, our part 1 also is over. Let's go on to part 2. In part 2, as I said, we will be discussing how the power got transferred from British government to the Indians. So the major two parties in this part throughout is British government and India. So in part 2, the first act is Indian Council Act of 1861. The Indian Council of 1861 was an act of British Parliament that made significant changes in the Governor-General Council. By this act, there was associative representative of Indian people with the work of legislation by nominating. Lord Canning nominated 3 Indians to the council in 1862, namely Raja of Benares, Maharaja of Patiala and Sir Dinakar Rao. Viceroy had the power to overrule the council if necessary. Secretary of State for India in Britain could also dissolve any act passed by the Governor-General's Council. Here was provision made for the formation of legislative council in other provinces. New provinces could also be created for the legislative purpose and lieutenant governors be appointed for them. Then comes the Indian Council Act of 1892. By 1885, the Indian National Congress was formed. Thus, there was a growing feeling of nationalism, and this led INC to put forth some demands to the British authorities. The demands there were mainly 3 demands by the INCs. The demands were to reform the Legislative Council. The second demand was for a principal election instead of nomination. The third demand was right to hold discussion on financial matters. The first demand, that is the reform of the Legislative Council, was approved by the Indian Council Act of 1892. The Act increased the number of additional or non-official members in the Legislative Council. The second demand, the principal election instead of nomination. Secretary of State agreed to a way of indirect election. Although the INC was asking for a direct election, Secretary of State agreed only for an indirect election. By this act, non-official members of the Indian Legislative Council were to be nominated by the Bengal Chamber of Commerce, and non-official members of Provincial Council were to be nominated by certain local bodies such as universities, district board, municipalities, zamindars, etc. That was based on the principle of representation. In the Legislative Council, out of 24 members, only 5 were Indians, but the number of Indians were increasing, thus it was a positive step. INC's third demand, right to hold discussion on financial matters. This was addressed as members were given the right to ask questions on budget or the matters of public interest, but they had to give notice of 6 days for it. They could not ask supplementary questions also. The British considered only to a little by this act. However, the British considered only a little this act. This had indirectly led to the formation of militant nationalism in India. Many leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak blamed Congress' moderate policy for the lack of positive development, and they called for more aggressive movement. Then comes the Morley Minto reforms. Lord Morley was the Secretary of State of India by that time, and Lord Minto was the Viceroy by then. The Lord Morley and Lord Minto recommended some reforms that's known as the Morley Minto reforms. By the Morley Minto reforms, the Legislative Council at the centre and provinces was increased in size. At the Central Legislative Council, the number increased from 16 to 60. The Legislative Council were empowered to move resolution on budget and on any matter of public interest, except certain specified subjects like armed forces, foreign affairs, and Indian states. The main reform was the introduction of separate electorate for Muslims. This act introduced the communal representation in Indian politics. This was intended to end the growing tide of nationalism in the country, dividing people on communal lines. Then comes the Montagu-Chelmsford report. Mr. E. S. Montagu was the Secretary of State of India on the year 1990, and Lord Chelmsford was the Governor General or the Viceroy of India. They both brought out a detailed report titled Constitutional Reforms in India, also called as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. This report became the basis of Government of India Act 1990. What is the main feature of the Government of India Act 1990? First one, this report introduced a bicameral legislature with two houses, Legislative Assembly and Council of States. These both are the forerunner of Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha. The subject of administration were to be divided into two categories, central and provincial. This like federal structure on a unitary basis. This is an example of federal structure on a unitary basis. The provinces were to follow a dual government system or diarchy. Diarchy or dual government system was followed in the provinces. That means the province subjects were subdivided into transferred and reserved subject. Also, the provincial budgets were separated from the central budget. Provincial legislature was empowered to make its own budget. Next is the Government of India Act 1935. This act is based on Simon Commission report and Third Roundtable Conference. There was a growing demand for constitutional reforms in India by the Indian freedom fighters. India's support to the Britain in the First World War was also for more inclusion of Indians in the administration of their own country. By this act, the Britishers prescribed a federation, taking the provinces and princely states as units. It was optional for the princely states to join the federation, and since they never joined, federation never materialized. This act proposed to divide the powers between centre and provinces. There were three lists which gave the subjects under each government. There was a federal list for the centre, provincial list for the provinces, and a concurrent list affecting both. In provincial government, diarchy was abolished, and in the central government, diarchy was introduced. A bicameral federal legislature would be established, namely the Federal Assembly and the Council of States. They had representative of princely states also. Reserve Bank of India was established as per the Government of India Act 1935. Then we'll discuss about the CRIPPS mission. When the World War II broke off, the Britain declared India as a party to the war, as a part of British Empire. This decision was made without consulting the Indian leaders, and this led to a massive protest from the Congress leaders. In order to get support from the Indian leaders, CRIPPS mission was sent. In March 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps, who is a member of British cabinet, came with a draft declaration on the proposals of British government. The CRIPPS mission was sent by British government to India in March 1942 to obtain Indian cooperation for the British war efforts in the Second World War. It was headed by Sir Richard Stafford Cripps, a Labour minister in Winston Churchill's coalition government in Britain. Cripps' mission proposed to set up a Indian Dominion. This Dominion would have the freedom to remain with the British Commonwealth or to move away from it. Also, the Cripps mission proposed a Constituent Assembly would be formed to frame a new constitution for the country. This assembly would have members elected by the provincial assemblies and also nominated by the princes. Any provinces unwilling to join the Indian Dominion could form a separate union and have a separate constitution. Transfer of power and right of minorities will be safeguarded by the negotiations between the Constituent Assembly and British government. In the meantime, until the new constitution came into force, India's defence would be controlled by the British and the power of Governor General would remain unaltered. Even then, the Indian National Congress and Muslim League objected to the CRIPPS mission proposals. What was the reasons behind INC's objections? Mainly three reasons were there. The first one being the province's right to separate from the union will damage the national unity. Also, they didn't like the idea that the Governor General's powers will be retained. And also, there was no plan for immediate power transfer from the British government. So, the INC objected to the CRIPPS mission proposals. And the League did not like the idea of single union of India. They wanted a separate states for Muslims. Since INC and Muslim League rejected the proposal, the CRIPPS mission was a failure. And Sir Stafford Cripps went back to England, and soon after that our Quit India movement started by the Gandhiji. Cabinet Mission Plan. The main two parties in India were the INC and the Muslim League. But both these parties had many ideological differences. Congress party wanted a strong centre with minimum power for the provinces, while the Muslim League wanted a strong political safeguard for the Muslims. Since the both parties could not find a common ground, the UK government itself proposed the idea for the transfer of power and resolved the constitutional deadlock between the Indian political leaders. That is known as the Cabinet Mission Plan. The objective of the mission was to help India achieve its independence as early as possible and to set up a constituent assembly. What are the main features of Cabinet Mission Plan? Cabinet Mission rejected the idea of separate state for Muslims, but the provinces will be divided into groups based on community. Also, a constituent assembly would be set up for writing new constitution for the country. An interim government would be established until a new government was formed on the basis of constitution written by the Constituent Assembly. Hence, for the formation of interim government, the Britishers proposed to have 5 members from the INC, 5 members from the Muslim League and 4 other members from the small parties. The Congress sent 5 members to the interim council. One of the members were Zakir Hussain. But League objected to it, saying he represented the Indian Muslims. So the League did not take part in the formation of interim government. Thus, Congress entered the Viceroy's interim council. The Muslim League's leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the League objected to the new central government. He started a brutal communal violence by demanding a separate state for the Muslims called Pakistan. And in this communal violence, over 5,000 people were killed. Finally, the Congress acknowledged the inevitability of the partition as a mean to stop this brutal violence. Then comes the Mountbatten Plan. Plan for transfer of power to the Indians and the partition of the country was laid down in the Mountbatten Plan. This was the last plan for Indian independence. Lord Mountbatten was the last Viceroy of India and the first Governor General of independent India. Indian Independence Act 1947. India got independence by passing this particular act. According to this act, British India was to be partitioned into two dominions, India and Pakistan. The constitution framed by the Constituent Assembly will be applicable only in India. The date for transfer of power was fixed as August 15, 1947. To fix the international boundaries between the two countries, that is, the India and Pakistan, a boundary commission also was established. Princely states were given a choice to either remain independent or to join India or Pakistan. As per this act, the office of Secretary of States was abolished. Also, the British monarch will no longer use the title Emperor of India. Until the time new constitution came into existence, the Governor General will rule the country in His Majesty's name. This is the last act. So our regulatory act section is over. So let's move on to the next section, that is previous year questions asked in SSC CGL examination. Let's discuss the first question. The federal structure for India was first put forward by the which act? Act of 1909 and Act of 1919, Act of 1935 or the Act of 1947? The answer is the Government of India Act 1935. Federal structure for India was first put forward by the Government of India Act 1935. By this act, the powers were divided between centre and provinces. There were three lists which gave the subjects under each government. There was a federal list for the central government, provincial list for the provinces, and a concurrent list for both the parties. Second question. What was the basis for constituting the Constituent Assembly of India? Basis for constituting the Constituent Assembly. Options are Resolution of Indian National Congress, Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, Indian Independence Act 1947, Resolution of Provincial or State Legislature of the Dominion of India. Answer is the Cabinet Mission Plan 1946. Third question. Indian Penal Code came into operation in 1858, 1860, 1859 or 1862? Answer is 1862. Indian Penal Code is the main criminal law of Criminal Code of India. It was drafted in 1860 and came into force in colonial India during the British Raj in 1862. Fourth question. Government of India Act 1935 was based on Simon Commission report, Lord Curzon Commission, Dimitrov thesis, and Lord Clive's report. Answer is Simon Commission report. Simon Commission was headed by Sir John Simon and was constituted in 1927. The purpose was to inquire into the working of Act of 1919. The Simon Commission submitted its report on 1930, and based on that report, the Government of India Act 1935 was formed. Fifth question. Who described the Government of India Act 1935 as a new charter of bondage? Mahatma Gandhi, Rajendra Prasad, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, or B.R. Ambedkar? Answer is Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru on the Faizapur session. When was the first Central Legislative Assembly constituted? Answer is 1920. First Central Legislative Assembly was constituted in 1920. Central Legislative Assembly was a legislature for India created by the Government of India Act 1919. So based on that, Central Legislative Assembly was formed on 1920. Seventh question. Who among the following proposed a suggestion for a Constituent Assembly for the first time? Nehru, Gandhi, J.P. Narayan or M.N. Roy? Answer is M.N. Roy. The idea of Constituent Assembly of India was first put forward by M.N. Roy in 1934. 8. In which of the following acts territorial division of governors in India was done? Government of India Act 1858, Indian Council Act 1861, Indian Council Act 1892, Government of India Act 1861. The answer is first one, the Government of India Act 1858. Government of India Act 1858 provided for liquidation of East India Company, transferred the power of government, territories and revenues to the British Crown. Company's territories in India were vested in the Queen, the company ceasing to exercise its power and control over these territories. India was to be governed in the Queen's name. Next question. Which of the following act system of diarchy was introduced at the center? Answer is the Government of India Act 1935 provided for diarchy at the center. Last question. Which of the following act introduced separate electorate for Muslims? Which of the following act started the communal representation? The answer is Act of 1909, second option. Divide the Hindu-Muslim unity. Indian Council Act 1909 introduced separate electorate for Muslims. Okay, so we have discussed all the regulatory acts. Previous year questions also were discussed. That's enough for the SSC CGL examination. All the best for the year exam. See you in the next class. Thanks for watching. And if you like our lectures, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.